Have you ever wondered how the European Union got to be so powerful? I mean, how did a bunch of treaties between countries turn into a legal system that can actually reach down and affect your daily life? Well, the answer is pretty revolutionary, and it all stands on two giant pillars.
It really all comes down to this one simple question. Let's say your country's government passes a law, but that law completely clashes with a rule coming from the EU. Which one do you follow? Now, this isn't just some abstract legal puzzle. This was the make-or-break challenge the early European community had to figure out if it was going to be anything more than just a talking shop.
Because, in the beginning, nobody was really sure. Were these treaties just suggestions? A set of international pinky promises where nations agreed to play nice with each other? Or was this something totally new, something with actual teeth? The answer, funny enough, didn't come from politicians. It came from the judges.
And here it is. This one sentence from the European Court of Justice was an absolute legal bombshell. The court basically said, look, the EU isn't just a club for countries, it's a new legal order, and its rules apply to everyone, not just the governments, but to individual people, you and me. And that changed everything.
This whole idea of a new legal order that included regular folks like us just kicked off a complete revolution. It meant that EU law wasn't just something for diplomats to argue over in fancy rooms. No, it was something that individual citizens could actually pick up and use. And that brings us to our first major turning point, which all starts with a couple of really important court cases.
The entire story of this transformation really comes down to these two cases, Vengeance and Lowe's and Costa v. ENL. These weren't just any old rulings. What the court did here in the early 1960s was basically build the constitutional foundation of the entire EU legal system from the ground up.
So first up, let's talk about Van Genden Lowe's. Picture this. You've got a Dutch import company. They get hit with a brand new tax on a chemical they're bringing in from Germany. And they say, hey, wait a minute, the EU treaty says you can't just introduce new customs duties like this. So the big question for the court was, could a private company, an individual really, use an EU treaty to sue its own government in its own national court?
The court's answer was a massive, system-shaking yes. And with that, they created the first pillar of EU law, the principle of direct effect. It basically means you as an individual have a direct line to walk into your local court and use EU law to fight for your rights. The court even said that this vigilance of individuals was a key part of making sure the law was followed.
And this was a huge deal. We're not just talking about some obscure clause. The court made it crystal clear that people could use the big stuff, the core treaties, EU regulations, which are kind of like universal laws for the whole EU, and even directives, which are goals that member states have to follow. This just opened the floodgates. Suddenly, everyday citizens became the enforcers of European law.
But wait, direct effect immediately created an even bigger, more explosive question. Okay, so a person can use EU law in their own country's court. Great. But what happens if that EU law directly contradicts a law that their own parliament just passed? This set the stage for a massive legal showdown. Who had the ultimate trump card?
And that showdown happened just 1 year later. This is the case of Costa versus ENL. An Italian guy, Mr. Costa, argued that his government's decision to nationalize the electricity industry was against EU law. But Italy had passed a national law to do it. So there you have it, a direct head-to-head clash, an Italian law versus an EU law. Who wins?
The court's ruling created the second pillar, the principle of supremacy. Sometimes people call it primacy. The judges declared that by joining the club, member states had permanently limited their own power. And because of that, no national law, no matter what it was, could ever override a law coming from the EU. EU law, they said, had to win. Every single time.
So this set up a brand new and totally absolute pecking order. Let's break it down. Step 1. EU law is at the top. It's superior. Step 2, it's superior to any conflicting national law. It doesn't matter if it's an old law, a new law, or even part of a country's own constitution. And Step 3, national judges have to apply EU law and just set aside any of their own country's laws that get in the way.
Okay, so now we have our two pillars, direct effect and supremacy.
They sound a bit abstract, right? But the best way to really get how they work together is to think of them as a sword and a shield for every single citizen.
Let's see how this plays out. Direct effect. That's your sword. It gives you the power to actually go to court and actively use a right that comes from EU law. But, what good is a sword if your opponent is wearing indestructible armor? That's where supremacy comes in. It's the shield. It guarantees that when you swing that sword, no conflicting national law can block your attack. So the sword empowers you, the citizen, while the shield protects the whole system, making sure the law is the same for everyone, everywhere in the Union.
Now, it'd be easy to think, okay, story's over, problem solved. But it's really not that simple. See, these two incredibly powerful ideas, especially supremacy, were created by judges, not by politicians writing a constitution. And because of that, they create this constant simmering tension with the legal systems of the member countries.
And that brings us to today, where the debate is still very much alive. The absolute no exceptions nature of supremacy. It's still challenged by some of the top courts in member states. This creates a really complex dance between national courts and the EU court. And yeah, it can lead to problems with enforcement. The core challenge is still the same one from the 60s. How do you make sure the law is applied the same way everywhere?
Which leaves us with this final thought to chew on. These twin pillars, direct effect and supremacy, they built a legal system that is unique in the world. It's incredibly powerful. But they did it by asking nations to give up a piece of their final say, their ultimate authority. So the question that started all of this back in the 1960s is really the same one we're still grappling with today. Is that trade-off worth it?